Reserve Bank has hiked interest rates 13 times since May 2022. The official cash rate is now 4.35%. But despite that, the latest monthly inflation figures show inflation is up. And economists are saying it would have had the Reserve Bank tipping more towards a rate hike next month. This is happening even as you've heard from the Queensland Business Chamber earlier this week that their members are struggling almost as much now as what they were during the global financial crisis. Revenue's down, business confidence is weak, and your mortgage is just getting higher and higher. Leith Van Onselen is the Chief Economist and founder of macrobusiness.com, and he joins me now to hopefully enlighten us about the blunt instrument of interest rate rises to bring down inflation. Hello, Leith.
G'day, Kathy. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm curious, what does this inflation data actually tell us, apart from all of the essentials that we rely on in life have all gone up?
Yeah, so it's important to know that this is just a monthly inflation indicator that the ABS reports, and it's not as comprehensive as the mainline quarterly inflation number, which obviously we get every quarter.
End of July is the next one, is that right?
That's right, yes. End of July, 31st of July is the next quarterly inflation reading, and that's the one that the Reserve Bank's going to be looking at most closely. That said, obviously the May monthly inflation indicator wasn't a great read. So it came in at 4%, which was higher than economists expected. It is important to note, though, that prices actually did fall by 0.1% in May.
If we noticed, 0.1%.
Yes, obviously, it's a rounding error, but the reason why the annual figure went up was because it actually fell by more in May last year. So because it measures the last 12 months, it actually rose. But look, it's certainly not going in the right direction, but it's important to note that the Reserve Bank has a whole bunch of data releases that come out between now and its next board meeting on the 6th of August. So it's got obviously the second quarter CPI quarterly data, which is the most important. It also has a labour market release, which comes out mid next month, and then also 2 retail sales figures. So it wouldn't have made up its decision yet on interest rates. Obviously, it'll be a little bit alarmed by these figures, but it'll wait for the next quarterly release to see what happens, because this data's only to May. It's not as comprehensive. And also, it's important to note that the Reserve Bank has to weigh up 2 things. So it's 2 key performance indicators are obviously getting inflation down to between its target, but the other one is also full employment. So if the labour market, the unemployment rate jumps up, and retail sales, which are already running at the weakest level since, about 30 years.
In 30 years? Wow.
Yeah, right. Yeah, outside the pandemic, so pretty much since the early 90s recession. If those also come in weak, that could also stay its hand on interest rates. So it does have a lot of other data releases to weigh up before it makes any decision, but it certainly will be alarmed, or at least alert from yesterday's monthly figures.
So clarify this for me. Interest rate rises are designed to quell spending, to bring down inflation. Is that right?
Yeah, basically quell demand in the economy. So consumer demand in the economy, and then that's the idea is that once you reduce demand, you'll reduce overall inflation in the economy.
So, but this latest inflation rise, my understanding is that it has been things like rent rises, housing prices, fruit and vegetable prices, and fuel that have all pushed them up. How are we meant to cut back on those things and still live?
Well, that there is the $1 million problem that the Reserve Bank has.
Right.
So the Reserve Bank has just one blunt tool, which is interest rates. And those interest rates really only impact about 1/3 of Australians. So that's 1/3 of Australians with owner-occupied mortgages. So effectively, they're smashing 1/3 of Australians to try and bring down inflation on behalf of all Australians. And the problem, as you alluded, is that obviously we have hyperinflation in rents. We've got strong inflation in building costs. Another one you didn't mention was that energy prices.
Oh yes, energy is the other one. Yeah.
Yes, and unfortunately, those things aren't dealt with very well via interest rates. So the Reserve Bank's thinking there is, okay, inflation's too high. We need to bring down demand. We don't necessarily bring down prices in those areas, but we'll smash the 1/3 of Australians to bring down demand in all the other areas, which will lower inflation. What we really need is for the federal government, which has many levers at its disposal, to help the Reserve Bank out and to bring down inflation. It can do it in a whole bunch of ways. So,
and what ways are those?
So, obviously one of the main drivers of Australia's inflation is housing. So that is both rents and also construction costs, things like that. That's nearly 1/4 of the inflation basket. And I'd argue that the main driver of housing inflation is actually excessive immigration at the moment, because we're bringing in near record numbers at the same time as we can't build houses, and that's obviously driving the massive rise in rents that we're experiencing across the country.
Why are we bringing in
immigration?
Why are we bringing in so many people? Is that because we need a workforce?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the arguments they use. We've got skill shortages. The problem is we've grown the population by 8.3 million people this century through high immigration, and we've got worse skill shortages than ever, so it doesn't really work. I'll add that the other area which the federal government needs to fix is energy. So, for example,
they are giving around the country, there are lots of rebates being handed out by state and federal governments towards energy. Is that going to help, or does that just help fuel inflation?
Well, it certainly will lower inflation in inflation of energy. Problem is, it could fuel inflation elsewhere because people spend it elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the main problem with it is it's not solving the underlying problem. So you've got to ask yourself, Queenslanders, for example, your state is an energy superpower. So you have unbelievable amounts of gas, you've got unbelievable amounts of coal, you're swimming in energy, and yet Queenslanders, if you exclude the state government subsidies, are paying some of the highest energy prices in the world. So how is it that you're paying unbelievably high gas prices when you export almost all your gas overseas?
Almost all the gas is sent overseas, that's right. And that forces up the price here, right?
That's right. And the reason for that is because the federal government, we're talking, a decade or so ago, approved the LNG export terminals in Gladstone without any domestic reservation. So East Coast Australia is the only jurisdiction in the world that exports gas that doesn't have a reservation scheme on gas, which means that we've basically been left with a situation where we have an artificial shortage domestically. Prices are extremely high, paying some of the highest prices in the world, despite the fact that we export more than 2/3 of our gas overseas. Now, as a counterpoint, Western Australians, which is a separate gas market because we're not linked with a pipeline, Western Australia exports over 80% of their gas, and yet they have cheap gas and electricity prices because they have a domestic reservation scheme in place, which ensures that Western Australians pay low prices and have abundant gas supplies. So that there is a federal government failure, and that is one of the reasons why Australia has sticky high inflation, because they've failed on energy and they've failed on housing by running a high immigration program.
It's 8:45 on 612 ABC Brisbane. Leith Van Onselen is the Chief Economist and founder of Macro Business, and we're talking about the rise in the monthly inflation rate, which has gone up to 4% from 3.6%. Leith, what is happening overseas? Because I did interviews on this very topic, I think it was December or January, and we were looking to overseas where interest rates were starting to come down, and we generally seem to follow what happens overseas. Are we following what's happening overseas or not?
Yeah, more or less. Most countries, so we're talking about the Anglosphere countries, like economies. Inflation pretty much rose almost in tandem. They're falling in tandem. So inflation is trending lower in Australia, just not as quickly as we'd like. There's only really two jurisdictions which have started cutting interest rates. That was Canada, which began last week. Canada's inflation's fallen faster than ours. They've also got a much weaker economy. And also the Eurozone did their first rate cut. So there's really only two central banks that have done it. They've only just started. We're pretty much following the other nations, more or less in unison. Inflation is falling across the globe, just not as quickly as most central banks would like.
I've heard and read the term that inflation is sticky, and the Federal Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers, says it's this last mile of inflation, the sticky last mile, that is the hardest to tackle, but then eventually it will come down. What do you think?
Yeah, I think inflation will come down. It's just obviously it's not coming down as quickly as we'd like. And again, I'd say it's because of these sort of pressure point areas like housing and energy and those sorts of things that are causing inflation to remain higher for longer. And I seem to emphasise energy a lot. And the reason why I do that is because energy inflation feeds into all other forms of inflation. So, for example, if you run a cafe and your energy costs are rising, well, then that increases your overall costs and you end up passing that on to consumers.
Or manufacturing or trucking.
Manufacturing, yeah, everything. So energy is the bedrock. And unfortunately, we've engineered a situation where Australians are paying some of the highest energy prices in the world, at least on the East Coast, which is 80% of Australia anyway. And that's unfortunately feeding into Australia's inflation problem. And really, that's why we need the federal government to step in with a domestic gas reservation scheme to bring down gas and electricity prices, because gas actually sets the electricity price as well. And to fix the energy mess, because, you know, it is absurd that we have a nation that is an energy superpower which has ample oodles of gas. We export, you know, around 80% of it nationally, and yet we've engineered a gas shortage and a gas crisis and higher gas prices. It doesn't make any sense.
I'm going to sound like I told you so, but I remember when they did that deal with the Gladstone deal and liquefied gas going offshore, and I thought, well, what about us? What if we need it? I do remember thinking that. Anyway, I am not an energy expert. Do you have anything positive to say today, Leith?
Look, you know, I suppose the positive thing is that it's not a done deal that interest rates are going to go up. There's still some more data points to come in. Obviously, the June quarter CPI, the labour force data, the retail sales data. So I guess we're just going to wait and see. But obviously, yesterday's figures were, you know, they weren't very heartening.
Not encouraging.
No, that's right. But we'll see how we go. Look, I mean, it's certainly not a fait accompli that rates are going to rise. It's just that there's the probability of rates rising has risen.
Leith Van Onselen, thank you very much.
Thanks, anytime.
Leith Van Onselen is the chief economist and founder of macrobusiness.com, and he says, well, while it wasn't encouraging, there are still some other data sets that the Reserve Bank will look at, including retail spending and unemployment before the quarterly inflation rate at the end of July. That's what they'll be looking at before they before they make a decision on increasing interest rates. Certainly, it doesn't sound like there's going to be any drop in interest rates anytime soon.